The Alpha King lifted the enemy's helmet and found the face of his own mate. The sky was a darkened canvas, heavy with clouds that seemed to mourn the coming storm. A bitter wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of blood. The Alpha King stood atop the hill, his cloak whipping around him like a shadow made flesh. His eyes, sharp as the winter frost, scanned the battlefield below where his army clashed with the enemy in a chaotic storm of swords and screams. He had seen many battles in his lifetime. He had led his wolves into war countless times, striking fear into enemies with the precision of a predator. But today, something felt different. An unease that crept along his spine, whispering that fate itself had stepped onto the field. The clash of steel echoed like thunder. His warriors, fierce and loyal, moved in disciplined waves, cutting down foes with silent efficiency. Yet, through the chaos, one figure stood apart, a champion of the enemy. Armored from head to toe, fought with a skill that rivaled his own. Every strike, every parry, was deliberate, calculated, and deadly. It drew the king's attention like a moth to flame. The king's wolf sense, honed over decades, recognized something in this warrior, a strength and fire that mirrored his own. He descended from the hill, moving with quiet power, as if the earth itself opened a path for him. His men parted instinctively, knowing the king's wrath was reserved for the rare moments when he faced a challenge worthy of his skill. The battlefield seemed to narrow until it was only him and the armored figure. Dust swirled around them, mingling with smoke and the cries of soldiers, yet time slowed as they circled each other. Then, with a single fluid motion, the king struck. His sword found a gap in the enemy's defense, and the world seemed to pause as he gripped the helmet and lifted it. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Beneath the visor was a face he knew, a face that belonged to his mate, the one he had never met, but whose existence had been whispered to him in dreams, visions that haunted him at night. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and recognition, met his own. For a moment the chaos of the battlefield fell away. The cries of soldiers, the clash of steel, the scent of blood, all of it vanished, leaving only the heartbeat between them. "Yea, you!" The mate's voice trembled, caught between disbelief and fear. "It can't be." The king's jaw tightened. His chest heaved as emotions he had never allowed himself to feel surged like a storm. Fury, confusion, longing, and protectiveness collided within him. He lowered the sword slightly, though he did not drop it. His wolf growled softly in his chest, a warning and a promise at once. "Fate is cruel," he said, his voice low and steady, though it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "And yet, it has brought us together on the battlefield." The mate's lips pressed into a thin line. Pride and defiance still shone in her eyes, even as her hands shook. She did not kneel. She did not beg. She simply stared at him, as if searching for answers in the cold steel of his gaze. A sudden movement behind her, a soldier of her army, snapped the king from his trance. With a wave of his hand he signaled to his warriors. A strike quick and precise sent the threat sprawling to the ground. The mate's eyes widened again, now with awe mingled with fear. "You protect me," she whispered, almost to herself. The king's lips curved into a faint shadow of a smile. "I do what I must," he said. "Even if it defies everything I know." He turned to the battlefield once more, signaling the retreat. His army followed. Cutting a path through the remaining enemies, the mate stumbled slightly, caught between fear and the raw pull of destiny that seemed to tether her to him. As they reached the safety of a ridge overlooking the valley, the mate finally spoke, her voice steadier. "Why did you spare me? You should have killed me." The king's eyes softened, though the hardness of command remained. "Because you are mine," he said simply. "And no enemy, no army, no fate itself can take that from me." The mate's eyes widened at the words, as if understanding for the first time that destiny was not always cruel. It could be binding in ways that demanded courage, not fear. They descended the ridge together, careful steps in the mud, surrounded by the lingering echoes of war. The mate's armor bore scratches and dents, a testament to the battle they had endured. Yet beneath the steel, beneath the blood and dirt, there was something unbroken, a strength that mirrored the king's own. As night began to fall, the wind carried a strange sound, a deep, rolling growl that was neither entirely human nor entirely beast. Both froze, instinctively scanning the darkened forest at the edge of the valley. Their bond, now awakened, seemed to stir something ancient in the shadows. "You hear it?" the maid asked, her voice a whisper. The king's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. "Something old, something dangerous. It senses what we cannot yet control." A low rumble rolled across the earth, and the trees shook as if the forest itself had drawn breath. The mate stepped closer to him, drawn by fear and the unexplainable pull between them. "Then we must move," he said, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting, almost accidental touch that sent a spark through them both. "Before it finds us." They ran toward the ridge where the king had planned to set up camp. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a threat. Yet in the midst of danger, there was a strange clarity. Their bond, newly awakened and undeniable, gave them strength. As they reached the camp, the king's warriors had already prepared a perimeter. Fires burned bright, their glow reflecting off the king's armor. He glanced at his mate, who stood tall despite the exhaustion, despite the fear. "You are stronger than I imagined," he said, and there was no jest in his voice. Only truth. The mate inclined her head, a faint, proud smile touching her lips. "And you are more than a king. You are something I never dreamed of." The king's wolf growled low in his chest, a sound that was part warning, part anticipation. "Dreams are often lies," he said. "But the truth is far more dangerous." They settled near the fire, the night growing colder around them. Soldiers slept in tense silence, but neither the king nor his mate could rest. Thoughts raced, questions burned, and the weight of destiny pressed down on them both. Suddenly a messenger arrived, breathless and mud-streaked.
"My king, the forest. Something moves there."
Not animal, not human. Something old, powerful.
"It is coming this way." The mate's eyes met the king's, wide with fear and wonder.
"You said fate brought us together. Is this part of it?" The king's gaze hardened, though his fingers brushed hers once more, seeking comfort in the connection that had already begun to shape their lives.
"It may be," he said quietly. "Or it may be a test."
Either way, we face it together. The forest beyond the valley rustled and shifted. A shadow moved within the darkness, impossibly large and silent. Both the king and the mate instinctively drew closer, the bond between them now a force neither could deny. The night air grew heavy, thick with anticipation. The stars above flickered through the clouds, pale witnesses to a bond that was just beginning to awaken. Somewhere deep within the forest, eyes glimmered with an intelligence both terrifying and knowing, and a low growl rolled across the valley once more. The king lifted his sword, though he did not turn from the mate. "Whatever comes, we survive," he said, "together." The mate's hand found his, gripping it tightly. "Together," she whispered. The shadow shifted again, closer now, moving like a storm of darkness. The firelight flickered across the king's face, revealing a mask of determination and fear. Destiny had brought them together, but fate had not yet revealed its full design. And then, a deafening roar echoed through the valley, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The soldiers froze, the wind howled, and from the forest, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, watching, waiting, calculating. Something ancient had awakened, drawn to the bond between them. The king tightened his grip on the mate's hand. "Stand ready," he said, his voice calm, though his heart raced. "The night has only begun." The mate swallowed, fear and awe mingling in her chest. I trust you," she said. The king's eyes softened, and for a single heartbeat, the battlefield, the war, and the weight of destiny faded. In that moment there was only them, bound by something older and stronger than both kingdoms combined. The shadow moved closer. The night held its breath. And the first challenge to their bond was about to strike. The firelight flickered across the valley as dawn crept over the horizon. Smoke from the battlefield still hung in the air, curling in ghostly ribbons above the mud-streaked earth. The Alpha King rode at the front of his small retinue, leading his mate away from the field. Soldiers moved in silence behind them, their eyes wary and alert. The mate walked with careful dignity despite exhaustion, her armor dented and blood-stained, though not her own. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet the king's eyes. Yet every so often she caught glimpses of him, towering, powerful, and impossibly magnetic. Each glance reminded her that fate had a cruel sense of humor. She had trained all her life to fight, to survive, and yet here she was, bound to the one being she could not oppose. The fortress loomed ahead, its spires cutting into the morning sky like jagged teeth. Built from black stone and guarded by walls thick enough to withstand an army, it had been the Alpha King's home for decades. Its gates opened silently, and the soldiers led the mate inside, their wariness never waning. Inside, the castle was a labyrinth of stone corridors and torch-lit halls. Shadows danced across the walls, carrying the faint scent of incense and smoke. The mate was guided to a private chamber, its windows overlooking the sprawling courtyard below. "You will stay here," the king said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "You are under my protection, though I suspect you already know that." "I don't need protection," the mate said, standing straight despite the ache in her limbs. "I need freedom." The king's gaze softened slightly, though his posture remained rigid. "Freedom is a luxury few are granted in times like these. You will have safety first. Freedom may come later." She studied him, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. There was no hatred in her eyes, though there was caution. "And if I refuse?" The king stepped closer, his shadow falling across the room. "Then you test the patience of an Alpha King," he said quietly, his eyes darkening with a mix of warning and something else, something she could not yet name. "But I will not harm you, not unless I must." That unspoken tension between them hung thick in the air. It was neither comfort nor threat. It was the weight of inevitability, the pull of a bond that had been forged long before either of them had drawn breath. Days passed in silence, broken only by the occasional command or the distant echoes of war outside the walls. The mate spent her time walking the corridors, training in secret, testing her strength against the castle guards, and trying to understand the strange magnetic pull she felt toward the king. The king, for his part, observed her from afar, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Desire, protectiveness, duty, and fear warred within him. He could not understand why fate had placed her before him as an enemy, yet he could not deny the connection that bound them. Every glance she stole, every subtle movement seemed to speak directly to him in a language older than words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the king entered her chamber. She looked up from the small practice sword she held, surprised by his sudden appearance. "You train well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Stronger than most I have seen." "I must be. My life depends on it." "And yet, you do not fight for yourself alone," he said, stepping closer. "I see loyalty, courage, and something else. Something that binds you even to me." She lowered the sword slightly, her heart hammering in her chest. "I do not know what you speak of." He crouched slightly, bringing his gaze to hers. "Do not lie to me. You feel it. The bond. It is older than both our families, older than the war. You may not understand it, but it pulls at you as it pulls at me." The mate's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and awe crossing her features. "Then, why would fate bring me to your side as an enemy? Why place me in your hands?"
The king's jaw tightened.
He could not answer fully, not yet, because the path of destiny is never simple. because love and power and loyalty are often tested by fire. A long silence followed. The maid looked away, out the window at the darkening courtyard. The wind rustled the banners, carrying whispers of battles yet to come. "You are a king of darkness," she said softly, almost to herself. "And yet," she hesitated, "and yet I feel something I cannot deny." The king's eyes softened, and for the first time the barriers of authority and power fell away. He reached out, his fingers brushing her hair back from her face in the gentlest of touches. "It is not denial you feel, it is recognition. Your soul knows mine, even if your mind does not."
Her breath caught, and she stepped back, though not fully.
Fear mingled with longing, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between them felt smaller than the walls around her. Before either could speak further, a sudden commotion erupted in the castle courtyard. Soldiers ran toward the gates, shouting warnings. The king's ears twitched as he caught the faintest hint of movement beyond the walls. Something unnatural, something deliberate. He turned to the mate, his voice low and urgent. "Stay here. Do not move. Trust me." She nodded, her heart racing. She had come to understand that his command was not mere authority. It was protection, fierce and absolute. The king disappeared from the room, leaving her with a storm of questions and a pulse of anticipation she could not contain. Moments later, the sounds of battle erupted in the courtyard. The maid pressed herself against the stone wall, peering out the window. Shadows moved among the torches, and she glimpsed figures larger than any human should be. They moved with grace and precision, like predators stalking prey. Fear twisted her stomach, but the bond to the king gave her courage. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breath. The creatures, whatever they were drawn to the castle, to the firelight, to her. The bond hummed within her chest, a resonance she could not fully explain. The king reappeared at the doorway, sword in hand, his presence commanding and calm despite the chaos outside. "Stay close," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and unspoken promise. "Do not run. Stand with me." She followed instinctively, stepping beside him as he led the soldiers into the courtyard. The creatures paused at the edge of the firelight, their eyes glowing, their movements deliberate. They were neither beast nor human entirely. Ancient, powerful, and they were aware of the bond between the king and his mate. The king lifted his sword, the metal catching the torchlight. "You will not pass," he said, his voice echoing across the stone walls. The creatures growled, low and threatening. Then, as if testing the waters, one stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on the mate. She felt a strange pull, like a thread connecting her to the being, something deep and old. "Do not be afraid," the king said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The creatures hesitated, then retreated into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. The wind carried the echoes of their growls, leaving a tense silence in the courtyard. The maid turned to the king, her eyes wide. What were they? He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "They are guardians of the old world," he said quietly. "Drawn to the bond between us, they test strength, courage, and loyalty. They will return, I promise you that." She swallowed hard, fear and awe mingling in her chest. "And if we are not ready?"
The king's hand tightened slightly over hers.
"Then we learn. Together, we have no other choice." That night the maid could not sleep. She lay on the hard stone bed staring at the torch-lit ceiling, replaying the day in her mind. The king's words, his touch, the creatures in the courtyard, all of it weighed heavily on her. She felt a strange mixture of dread and longing, a pull toward a destiny she had never chosen. The Alpha King, meanwhile, paced in the hall outside her chamber. His mind was a whirlwind of strategy, emotion, and the unfamiliar ache of possessiveness. The bond between them hummed like a living thing, and he knew that the days ahead would test not only their strength but their hearts. And as the first light of dawn crept over the castle, painting the black stone with shades of gold and crimson. Both king and mate understood one undeniable truth. Their fates were intertwined. Their destinies were bound. And nothing, not war, not curses, not even the shadows of the old world, could sever the bond that had been awakened on the battlefield. But the forest beyond the walls waited, and the shadows within it stirred once more. The castle woke under a heavy gray sky. The first rays of dawn filtered through clouds that threatened rain. Inside the great hall, the Alpha King sat upon his throne. His eyes narrowed as he reviewed reports from scouts and sentries. Outside, the kingdom still bore the scars of war, but the greatest threat was not soldiers or invading armies. It was something far older, far darker, that had stirred when his mate had been revealed on the battlefield. His mate moved silently through the corridors, training with the soldiers who had survived the recent clashes. Every strike, every block, was precise, controlled, and full of purpose. She had grown stronger in the days since the battle, her bond with the king giving her courage she had never known. Yet even as she trained, unease pricked at the edges of her mind. The forest beyond the castle walls had been quiet, but she knew that its silence was deceptive. "Your movements are too cautious," the king said, his voice cutting through the training hall like steel. He stepped closer, his gaze sharp, yet full of an unspoken admiration. "Do not hold back. You are stronger than you think."
The mate paused, breathing hard, and looked at him.
"I do not want to fail you, or the kingdom," she admitted. "But I am afraid." The king's expression softened, and he knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "Fear is not weakness. It is proof that you are alive, that you care. But courage is choosing to act even when fear is present. Remember that." She nodded, feeling the bond between them pulse stronger in response to his words. It was no longer just a pull of destiny. It was a force that gave her strength, clarity, and purpose. As they trained, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hall. A young messenger arrived, his face pale and eyes wide.
"My king, something is happening in the outer courtyard."
There are shadows moving. And one of the advisors, he is gone, disappeared. He turned to the mate, his eyes dark with warning. "Stay here. Trust no one outside this hall." She nodded, but her instincts rebelled. She had seen enough to know that danger rarely waited for permission. The king moved swiftly, his soldiers flanking him as they descended to the courtyard. The sight that greeted him froze his blood. Shadows twisted among the pillars and torches, figures moving with unnatural grace and intent. His senses screamed that these were not human, not entirely, yet not fully beast. Their eyes glowed faintly, filled with intelligence and a hunger for power. One shadow stepped forward, larger than the rest. Its movements were deliberate, calculating, almost regal. The king's hand brushed the hilt of his sword, though he did not strike immediately. Something in the air warned him. Rash action could make this far worse. "You come for her," he said, his voice low, carrying both command and warning. "She is mine."
The creature's head tilted, as if amused by his assertion.
Its eyes, glowing amber, locked onto the mate who had silently followed him into the courtyard, drawn by the bond they shared. Her chest tightened as the ancient force seemed to measure her, weigh her soul. "You are bound," it said, its voice not human, echoing in the king's mind as much as his ears. "Bound by blood, by destiny, by power you do not yet understand." And yet, there is hesitation, doubt, weakness. The king stepped in front of her instinctively, hand brushing hers in a silent gesture of reassurance.
"I am no stranger to doubt," he said,
Voice firm. "But strength is found when we face it together. Leave her, or face the consequences." The creature growled low, a sound that reverberated through stone and bone. Then, with a sudden movement, it vanished into the shadows, leaving the courtyard silent but charged, as if the castle itself held its breath. The maid turned to the king, her eyes wide. What was that?" "An old force," he said, jaw tight, eyes scanning the forest. "Drawn to the bond between us. They will test you. Test me. test us both. And soon, days passed in tense silence. The court moved with careful caution, whispering of the king's mate, of the strange events in the courtyard, and of the unknown forces stirring in the forest. The mate spent her time in training and study, learning the history of the kingdom, the curses that had long haunted it, and the powers that had been dormant for centuries. Late one evening she sat in the library, poring over ancient texts when the king entered. His cloak brushed the floor, his presence filling the room with a gravity that made her chest tighten. "You read too much," he said softly, though his eyes were stern. "Knowledge is power, yes, but it can also paralyze the mind." She looked up, defiance flashing in her eyes. "And ignorance leaves one at the mercy of fate." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You are learning fast, faster than I expected, faster than many of my warriors." She felt the warmth of his presence, the pull of the bond, and for a moment words failed her. She was caught between awe, fear, and something she dared not name. Before they could speak further, the doors to the library burst open. A shadow moved swiftly, almost invisible in the dim light. The maid reacted instantly, drawing a small dagger she had kept hidden. But the king was faster. He intercepted the figure with a single motion, his hand gripping their wrist and throwing them to the ground with controlled force. The figure struggled, writhing in the torchlight. When the mask fell away, the mate gasped. It was one of the king's most trusted advisors, someone she had been told she could trust. But the eyes staring up at her now were filled with something dark and calculating.
Why? She whispered.
The king's jaw tightened. "Betrayal often wears a familiar face," he said. His voice was cold, but beneath it was an edge of sorrow. "We cannot trust everyone, even those closest to us." The advisor struggled, but the king's grip was unyielding. "They came to test the bond," he said, "to see if it could be broken, to see if you could be swayed. Do you understand now why you must be cautious?" The maid nodded, her pulse racing. "I understand." The king released the advisor, who slumped to the ground, defeated but alive. "This is a warning," he said. "The court, the kingdom, even the forest itself is watching. Every choice you make, every step, will have consequences. You must learn quickly or fail." She swallowed hard, realizing that the life she had once known, the battles she had trained for, were nothing compared to the trials now before her. And yet, despite the fear, she felt a flicker of pride. She had survived the battlefield. She had faced betrayal, and she was still standing. Over the following weeks, the bond between the king and his mate deepened. They shared quiet conversations in the hallways, training sessions that tested body and mind, and moments of silence where words were unnecessary. Every touch, every glance carried meaning. Every heartbeat was a reminder that destiny had placed them together, whether they wished it or not. One night, as rain hammered against the castle windows, the king and the mate stood atop the highest tower, overlooking the kingdom. The storm raged around them, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder shaking the stone beneath their feet. "You feel it, don't you?" the king said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The weight of everything that is to come. The shadow of the old world, the curse, the enemies who watch us. You feel it, pulling at your soul." The maid nodded. "I feel it. And yet, I also feel something else. Strength. Courage. A bond I cannot deny, even if it terrifies me." He reached for her hand, gripping it firmly. "That bond is more than destiny. It is power. It is the force that can save or destroy kingdoms. But we must control it. Together." A flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, and with it came the faintest shimmer of movement in the forest. Eyes glowed, and a low growl rolled across the distance. The creatures were returning, drawn again to the bond between them. The maid pressed closer to the king instinctively. "Are we ready?" she whispered. He tightened his grip, his gaze fierce and protective. "We will be," he said. "Whatever comes, we face it together, and nothing will break us." The wind howled, carrying the promise of storms both literal and figurative. Shadows moved in the distance, unseen but present. The kingdom, the court, the forest, all were shifting in anticipation, and the bond between the Alpha King and his mate pulsed like a living thing, a force neither could control, yet both would need to survive what was coming. The night was heavy with wind rain lashing against the black stone of the castle. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the spires and walls, casting them in stark, shifting shadows. The Alpha King stood atop the highest battlement, his cloak flapping violently, eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the walls, the ancient forces stirred. The creatures of the forest, drawn to the bond between him and his mate, were coming, not to negotiate, but to test, to destroy, to claim. Beside him his mate stood firm, soaked by the storm but unwavering. Her armor gleamed faintly in the lightning, and her eyes, though wide with fear, held courage. She had grown stronger in the days since her arrival, learning not only to defend herself but to command the strength that had always been hers. Now, side by side with the king, she felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon them both. "They come," she whispered, voice steady despite the wind. "I feel them, all of them." The king's jaw tightened. "And we will face them. Together." He reached for her hand, gripping it firmly. The bond between them pulsed, a living, breathing force. The forest, the shadows, the old world itself seemed to hum in response. From the darkness figures emerged, their movements silent and predatory. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, reflecting the lightning above. They were neither fully human nor fully beast, and their presence was heavy with ancient power. The king's warriors took their positions, forming a protective line around the castle's outer walls, but even they seemed small in the face of what approached. The largest figure stepped forward. Its presence radiated authority, and even the king felt a chill. It was not just a creature, it was a guardian of the old world, a remnant of the forces that had shaped kingdoms long before any crown was forged. Its eyes locked onto the mate, and she felt a strange pull, as if invisible threads connected them. Fear and fascination mingled in her chest. "You are bound," the guardian's voice echoed, "not through the air, but directly in the mind of the king and mate. Bound by destiny, bound by power. Yet you hesitate. You are not ready." The mate swallowed hard. "I am ready," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I will not be afraid." The king stepped forward, placing himself between her and the guardian. "You will not test her beyond what she can endure," he said, his voice low but carrying the absolute authority of an alpha. "We are stronger than you know. Together, nothing can break us." A low growl rolled from the guardian, and the shadows behind it stirred. Then, without warning, it attacked. Lightning flashed as the creatures moved with blinding speed. The king drew his sword, its blade singing as it cut through the stormy air. He moved with precision, striking down one of the shadows before it could reach the walls. The mate moved beside him, her own training and newfound strength evident in every strike. She parried, dodged, and struck, her movements precise and powerful. Where fear might have frozen her before, now courage drove her. Every blow she landed seemed to strengthen the bond between her and the king, and the creatures faltered, sensing the force they could not overcome. Yet the battle was not without cost. One creature leapt from the shadows, striking the king with enough force to stagger him. Pain shot through his side, but he did not fall. His wolf growled, a deep, resonant sound, and he rose, eyes burning with determination. The mate reached him instantly, her hand on his arm. "We fight as one," she said. "Do not falter." He nodded, breathing heavily, and together they moved as a single force. The bond between them now pulsed visibly, a golden light radiating from their connection. The guardians recoiled, sensing that the power of their unity was far greater than expected. Suddenly the largest guardian stepped forward again, its eyes locking on the king. "Your bond is strong," it said. "But can it endure the true test?" The king's grip on his sword tightened. "We will endure," he said. "Whatever comes, We face it together." Then the guardian raised its massive hand, and the storm seemed to intensify. The ground trembled beneath them. The wind screamed through the battlements, and the castle walls shook. The mate felt a wave of energy surge through her, fear and power intertwined. She faltered for a moment, but the king's hand found hers, grounding her. "You are mine," he said, voice steady. "Nothing will take you from me." The words were more than a promise. They were a declaration, a force that rippled through the storm. The guardian hesitated as if struck by something unseen. The bond between king and mate flared, bright and unstoppable, casting light across the courtyard. The creatures recoiled, and one by one they vanished back into the shadows of the forest. The largest guardian remained, staring at them, as if recognizing the strength of a bond that even ancient powers could not sever. Then, slowly, it stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. The storm began to subside, leaving only the soft patter of rain on the stone. The king and mate stood together, breathing heavily, soaked but victorious. Around them, the soldiers began to emerge from hiding, awe and relief on their faces. The mate turned to the king, her chest heaving. We did it! We survived!" The king lowered his sword, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "We did more than survive," he said. "We proved that even the oldest forces cannot break the bond between us. Together we are stronger than fate itself." For the first time since she had met him on the battlefield, the mate allowed herself to relax. The tension that had held her body in its grip for days began to ease. She had faced fear, betrayal, and ancient power, and she had not only survived but grown stronger. The king reached for her, taking her hand in his. "Your courage, your strength, it humbles me," he said. "I have seen many warriors, many mates, but none like you, none who could stand as you have." The mate felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of pride, relief, and something deeper, something she had not yet named. She had been trained to fight, to survive, to follow duty, but now she understood that there was power in unity, in trust, in love. They walked together through the castle, silent but connected. The rain had softened, and the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, illuminating the black stone with a golden light. It was as if the world itself recognized their victory, their bond, and the dawn of something new. Inside the castle, life began to return to its rhythm. Soldiers cleaned the battlements, the kitchens prepared meals once more, and the courtiers whispered of the events of the night. The king and mate walked through the halls, their presence commanding, yet softened by the shared trials they had endured. Later, in the quiet of the private chamber, the king and mate stood by the window looking out over the kingdom. The forest beyond remained dark, mysterious, but its threat had lessened, for now. The bond between them had not only survived, it had grown stronger, a beacon of light against the shadows. "You have changed me," the king said softly, his hand brushing hers. "Not just because of what we faced, but because of who you are. You have brought balance to the darkness I carried for so long." The mate's eyes glistened. "And you have shown me that strength is more than skill. It is heart, courage, and the willingness to face what others cannot. I could not have survived without you." The king's wolf growled softly in his chest, a sound of agreement, and he leaned closer. "We have survived together," he said. "And we will continue whatever comes. Our bond, our fate, it is ours to shape." Outside the window, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of new beginnings. The shadows of the forest were no longer merely threats. They were reminders of the trials they had endured, and of the strength that lay within them both. In that quiet moment, the king and mate understood the truth of their connection. It was not only destiny that had brought them together, nor the battles they had fought. It was the choice they had made to trust each other, to stand together, and to face fear and power with hearts aligned. And as the sun rose, breaking the clouds and bathing the kingdom in light, they knew that whatever the future held, storms, shadows, or enemies, They would face it side by side, unyielding and unbroken. The Alpha King and his mate had survived the first trials of fate, but their journey was only beginning. The kingdom would remember this night, the bond that had conquered fear, betrayal, and ancient power. And somewhere deep in the forest, eyes still watched, waiting, but now with caution. They had underestimated the strength of love, courage, and destiny united. For the king and mate, there was no turning back. Together, they were a force the world had never known, unbroken, unyielding, and eternal.